The rain beat heavily against the glass of the small, dimly lit workshop. Fabric scraps littered the floor, and the sharp scent of old iron and expensive silk filled the air. A heavy, silver-plated revolver rested on the cutting table, right next to a pair of professional Tailor shears. The cold steel looked completely out of place against the delicate lace and rich fabrics, yet it belonged there tonight. Don Alessandro stood in the center of the small room, his imposing figure casting a long, dark shadow across the walls. His expensive wool coat was stained with fresh blood, and his dark eyes burned with an intense, unreadable fire. He did not look like a man who asked for favors. He looked like a god who demanded sacrifices. He stepped closer to the workbench, his polished leather shoes clicking softly against the worn wooden floorboards. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and touched the roll of deep crimson velvet resting on the table. His long, scarred fingers traced the soft texture of the fabric, but his eyes never left the woman standing across from him. "You have 24 hours to turn this fabric into a masterpiece," Alessandro said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the small room. "It must be perfect, flawless, and strong enough to command an entire room." Clara stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was a plus-size woman, used to hiding herself in oversized sweaters, used to being entirely invisible to the wealthy elites who walked the upper streets of the city. But tonight, under the intense, heavy gaze of the city's most feared mafia boss, she felt completely exposed. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she refused to look down or show her terror. "And who is the lucky woman?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to sound professional and calm. "I will need her exact measurements if you want it to fit like a second skin." Alessandro took another step forward, closing the distance between them until she could smell the rich scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the metallic tang of gunpowder. He reached out, his rough hand gently but firmly gripping her chin, forcing her to look directly into his dark, dangerous eyes. "Before we reveal the one impossible question that changed her life forever, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like." A voice echoes through the darkness of the story. "You won't want to miss a single second of this dark, dangerous romance." Alessandro's thumb brushed against her lower lip, his gaze dropping to the curve of her hips before rising back to meet her terrified, wide eyes. The silence between them grew heavy, charged with an undeniable, suffocating tension. "The dress is not for my mother, nor is it for any of the fragile women who seek my attention," Alessandro whispered, his voice dangerously close to her ear. "The dress is for you, Clara, and tomorrow night, you will wear it." Clara had spent her entire life operating in the shadows of the glamorous city, completely ignored by the wealthy elite. She was a curvy, full-figured woman living in a world that constantly demanded women to be small, fragile, and practically invisible. Her days were spent in the suffocating heat of her late father's old tailoring workshop, breathing in dust and steam. Her fingers were permanently calloused, dotted with small, painful needle pricks from working 16 hours a day. When her father passed away a year ago, he left her nothing but a legacy of beautiful craftsmanship and a mountain of crushing, impossible debt. The local loan sharks didn't care about art or beautiful dresses. They only cared about cash and blood. Every single week, brutal men with broken knuckles and cheap suits would kick open her door, demanding money she simply did not have. They would laugh at her size, call her cruel names, and threaten to burn her livelihood to the ground. Clara learned to survive by making herself as small and unnoticeable as possible, blending into the background of her own life. She wore dark, shapeless clothes to hide her voluptuous body, hoping that if she didn't look at the world wouldn't look at her. She watched the wealthy, thin women of the high society crime families walk past her shop window every day, wrapped in expensive furs and glittering diamonds. They looked down on her, treating her like a servant, a tool to fix their expensive garments, rather than a real human being.
But Clara possessed a sharp, brilliant mind and a rare, incredible talent for structure and design.
She understood how fabric moved, how a single seam could completely transform a person's posture and confidence. On this particular night, the rain poured down in a relentless sheet, flooding the dark alleys outside her workshop. Clara worked late into the night under a single flickering light bulb, her eyes burning with sheer exhaustion. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of her shop burst open, with a violent, echoing crash that shattered the quiet night. The cold wind rushed in, bringing with it the smell of ozone, wet asphalt, and the sharp, undeniable scent of fresh blood. A tall man stumbled into the shop, clutching his side as dark crimson blood seeped through his fingers and stained his white silk shirt. It was Don Alessandro, the undisputed king of the city's criminal underworld, a man whose name was only spoken in terrified whispers. He had been ambushed by a rival family just 3 blocks away, his bodyguards scattered or dead in the wet streets. He needed a place to hide, a discreet sanctuary where his enemies wouldn't think to look for him. Clara gasped, dropping her shears as she recognized the terrifying man bleeding out on her old floorboards. Her first instinct was to scream, to run out into the rainy night, but years of survival had given her nerves of pure steel. "Lock the door," Alessandro ordered, his voice weak, but still possessing the absolute authority of a man who commanded thousands of soldiers. He collapsed heavily against her cutting table, his face pale from the rapid loss of blood. Outside, the heavy, synchronous sound of footsteps echoed down the narrow alleyway, accompanied by the distinct clicking of automatic weapons. His pursuers were close, searching every door, hunting for the wounded lion. Clara didn't hesitate. She locked the heavy deadbolt, turned off the main light bulb, and plunged the workshop into complete darkness.
She grabbed Alessandro by his uninjured shoulder, guiding his massive, muscular frame toward the back of the shop. She hid him beneath a massive, heavy rack of winter coats and thick rolls of woolen fabric, completely concealing him from view. Just as she stepped back into the main room, a violent, heavy fist began to pound against the front glass door. 2 large, armed hitmen kicked the door open, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the dusty air. They demanded to know where the Don was, their guns pointed directly at Clara's chest. Clara did not blink. She utilized her heavy, imposing presence to block their view of the back room, standing tall and completely calm. She lied smoothly, telling them a wounded man had run past her shop toward the docks, her voice steady and entirely devoid of fear. The men stared at her with contempt, dismissing her as just a frightened, unimportant working-class woman, and left without searching the back.
They never expected an invisible, ordinary girl to possess the immense courage to look death in the eye and lie. Once the danger passed, Clara pulled Alessandro out from the shadows and forced him to sit down in her sewing chair. She did not wait for his permission. She grabbed her sharpest sewing kit, alcohol, and clean linen bandages. With steady, precise hands, she cut away his expensive shirt, revealing a deep, ugly graze along his ribs. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, her fingers gentle but firm as she stitched the torn flesh with the same precision she used on fine silk. Alessandro watched her through heavy, pain-filled eyelids, fascinated by her absolute calmness, her sharp intelligence, and her lack of fear. No one had ever touched him like this, not with fear or desire for his money, but with pure, practical care. The next morning, the workshop was surrounded by a fleet of black luxury SUVs, his loyal soldiers finally arriving to secure the area. Alessandro stood up, fully healed and dressed in a fresh suit brought by his men, looking more powerful than ever. He did not leave her shop with just a simple thank you. He had her brought directly to his heavily guarded, sprawling estate on the hill. Clara was led into a massive, marble-lined study where Alessandro sat behind a heavy mahogany desk, looking like a king on his throne. He wanted to test her, to see if her loyalty was real or if she was simply waiting for a massive financial payout. He threw a thick briefcase filled with stacks of $100 bills onto the desk between them, the money catching the light. "This is more money than you will ever see in 3 lifetimes, Clara," Alessandro said, his dark eyes studying her every reaction. "Take it, leave the city, and forget everything you saw last night. Or stay and become part of my world." He looked at her, his gaze dropping to her voluptuous curves, which were tightly restricted by her cheap, worn-out clothing.
He asked her the ultimate, impossible question. Are you loyal to the man who can kill you, or are you loyal to the money that can save you? Clara looked at the money, then looked directly into his eyes, her chin lifted with a fierce, unbreakable dignity that shocked him. "I don't want your blood money, Don Alessandro. I saved you because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted a reward." Alessandro's dark eyes flared with a sudden, intense obsession. He had never met a woman with such a powerful, independent spirit. He closed the briefcase, stood up from his desk, and walked over to her, his presence utterly overwhelming. Within 24 hours, Clara's life changed completely as Alessandro took total control of her financial destiny. He sent his most brutal enforcers to the loan sharks who had terrorized her, breaking their hands and erasing her debts permanently.
He bought out her entire workshop, transforming it into a private, high-end atelier dedicated solely to his personal needs. But he didn't want her to make clothes for his soldiers. He wanted her to create something magnificent for herself. He ordered the city's finest fabric merchants to deliver rolls of the most expensive, deep crimson velvet directly to his mansion. He banned any attempts by his servants to give her loose, shapeless clothes, demanding she embrace her natural form. Alessandro brought in a team of elite high-fashion designers, forcing them to work under Clara's direct, expert supervision. "Do not hide her curves," Alessandro warned the designers coldly, his hand resting on his gun. "Enhance them. Make her a goddess." For the first time in her life, Clara felt truly seen, celebrated, and protected by a man who didn't want her to change.
She designed a breathtaking, form-fitting velvet dress that hugged her voluptuous waist, accentuated her hips, and flowed like liquid fire. The night of the Grand Criminal Gala arrived, an exclusive event where the entire underworld elite gathered in a gold-leafed ballroom. The room was filled with arrogant, thin women wrapped in diamonds, all vying for the Don's dangerous attention. When Clara stepped through the double doors, the entire ballroom fell into a sudden, stunned, and judgmental silence. She stood tall in her magnificent crimson velvet dress, her rich curves on full display, looking absolutely radiant but incredibly vulnerable. The whispers began instantly, cruel and sharp as knives, as the wealthy women mocked her size and laughed at her presence. They couldn't understand why a plus-size tailor was standing in a room meant only for the thin, elite rulers of the city. Alessandro walked down the grand staircase, his dark eyes locked onto Clara, ignoring every other beautiful woman in the room. He stepped onto the main stage, grabbed the microphone from the announcer, and silenced the entire room with a single, icy glare. "This woman is the finest, most beautiful thing in this entire room." Alessandro's voice boomed through the speakers, shaking the crystal chandeliers. "She is my future wife, and anyone who dares to smile or whisper against her will lose their business and their life before the sun rises." The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, heavy enough to suffocate. The wealthy elite stood frozen, their wine glasses suspended in mid-air, their faces turning pale under the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. Alessandro stepped down from the stage, his movements slow, deliberate, and full of lethal grace. He walked straight through the parting crowd, his eyes never leaving Clara, completely ignoring the terrified stares of his business partners. He stopped right in front of her, offering his large, scarred hand with a rare, gentle warmth that none of his enemies had ever seen. Clara placed her trembling hand in his, feeling the immense strength and heat of his grip instantly steadying her beating heart. "You are beautiful, Mia Regina," Alessandro murmured, his voice a low, private rumble meant only for her ears. He led her toward the center of the dance floor, forcing the entire room to watch as he pulled her voluptuous body close against his chest. As they moved together to the slow, dramatic rhythm of the orchestra, the whispers of the crowd completely died out, replaced by a deep, respectful fear. The very women who had laughed seconds ago now lowered their eyes, unable to meet Clara's gaze. The next morning, Alessandro's promise was executed with brutal, mathematical precision. 3 of the most powerful families whose wives had mocked Clara found their assets frozen, their warehouses seized, and their leadership replaced by Alessandro's loyal men. He did not just protect her, he elevated her to a position of absolute power, making her the undisputed head of his empire's new luxury textile division. Her old workshop was replaced by a massive, marble-fronted atelier in the most expensive district of the city. Clara no longer wore the shapeless, dark clothes of an invisible girl drowning in debt. She stood before her empire wrapped in rich silks, fine cashmeres, and the deep crimson velvet that had changed her life forever, her natural curves celebrated by the world. Alessandro stood by her side, his arm wrapped tightly around her waist, his fierce, protective gaze warning the world that she belonged to him. They had built a kingdom out of blood and silk, and no one would ever dare to look down on her again. Would you have the courage to wear the velvet dress into a room full of enemies? Tell us in the comments below.